There's been many attempts to bring hands into virtual reality. After all, they are the most intuitive way we interact with our surroundings. But most VR content on PC is designed for controllers, and whether it be UI or gameplay, it doesn't always translate to hands. So how do we bridge the gap? These are the UDCAP gloves provided by UDEX Real. Sure, it's a mocap glove with some controller parts slapped on, but it might also be the perfect bridge between the past and the potential future of VR. But do they actually do the job? Okay, so this is an early unit. I've been told it's close to the full functionality of the final product, but consider this my first impressions. Unboxing these for the first time was a little nerve-wracking. There are 4 sizes available. I had to measure my fingers for the correct size glove, and I was really hoping I didn't mess this up and have to send them back. Thankfully though, this wasn't an issue. There was a bit of a snug fit, but the fabric is surprisingly thin and very flexible. Holding things works just fine. You could even type. Just don't expect to crank open a cold one. There's just too much flex for that kind of grip. The gloves use thin elastic sensors that are on top of your fingers for tracking their movements, and I am very curious to see how well these work in VR. In addition, you have a joystick and 2 buttons on each of your index fingers. The joystick placement feels perfect. The buttons are a little off to the side, but you get used to it. Both buttons pressed together activates the system menu, and the joystick does have a click if you find yourself needing one more extra input. There is a haptic motor under the joystick, but don't expect anything more than that. Although this whole module can be removed or replaced. Okay, so that takes care of the buttons, but where's the trigger? Just twitch your index finger, like you've got an invisible gun. Likewise, grab is emulated by closing your middle and ring finger. By the way, this is the Valve Index Controller, also known as the Knuckles. It's a common controller with a finger-sensing touchpad, so I'll be using it as a point of comparison. The glove's gesture controls benefit a lot from games that already have Knuckles support, letting you emulate things like pulling back a bow or grabbing objects. And the granularity of that finger tracking is certainly a step above the Knuckles. You gain access to finger splay, so you can finally spread those beans wide. This was my first time using mocap gloves, so I wasn't quite sure what to expect. Regular finger curling works fine, just don't expect to twist over your fingers like sign language. As for positional tracking, we've got a BYOD policy. Bring your own device. My kit came with the hardware to mount a Vive or Tundra tracker, an ideal pairing. I'm still rocking the Vive 2.0 trackers, and despite being a bit bulkier, they work just fine. Through continuous calibration with my Quest Pro and a Tundra tracker, they're just as good as any other Lighthouse device. Using Quest 3R Pro controllers could be a more economical option. Unfortunately, the kit doesn't include any hardware to mount them. I've been searching over Thingiverse for a 3D printable mount, but no luck yet, and I'm not ready to break out the duct tape. Now it seems like the final battery life is still up in the air, but I had no problem lasting a typical evening in VR. 2 USB dongles connect the gloves to the computer. On one hand, I'm super happy that these work well, but on the other, I am seriously running out of USB ports. Getting the gloves calibrated wasn't hard. In fact, the whole setup process was fairly straightforward. The software does have support for VMC and OSC for VTubing, but I'm going to focus mostly on the Steam VR functionality. If the branding is any indication, VRChat should be a great fit for these gloves. Here, players can see you physically gesture with your hands, assuming you work up the courage for social interaction. Many worlds also benefit from games that have more traditional controls. This is all very conveniently timed with VRChat's recent update to Steam Input 2.0, and a lot of models are going to need tweaking for the new finger poses. But this does mean that we can now have full skeletal hand movement. Using the gloves for the first time is a bit of a magical moment. Having everything you need to move around while also being able to stop and gesture midair is just really cool to experience firsthand. With that being said, there's a bit of a learning curve to the gesture inputs. Even knowing how they work, you'll need to train your hands to navigate through the menus. Thankfully in VRChat, everything is pretty big and easy to click on. I wasn't really making use of VRChat's hand tracking gestures. At times, they can actually get in the way, like accidentally moving when I didn't press my joystick. Now, while the more granular finger movement and splay were visible to other players, they are more of a detail than anything else. It's not quite as big of a change as something like full body or face tracking, Most other players will probably just think you're using an index at first glance. The main benefit is your own immersion with a bit of extra detail, at least in my opinion. Outside of VRChat, games designed for Knuckles controllers tend to make more logical sense when adapted to the gloves. They're a bit like a bridge between the two worlds. The immersive feeling carries over. It's fun to just grab things or poke around exploring the world. Not every game is going to have full finger tracking, but even those that don't, if they work with Knuckles, they're probably going to be okay. Unless that game is Beat Saber. Look, I know no one's buying this to cut cubes. It's a good stress test. The fabric is very flexible, but this also means the tracker slightly shakes while doing fast movements. Your slashing will become unstable at high speeds. Now, I'm not the most amazing player, but fast-paced songs were even more impossible than usual. Go ahead and blame my Vive 2.0 trackers, but the 3.0 version is only 15% lighter. This slight wobble is an issue in desktop usage and small UI in general. Now, the gloves do slowly lose calibration over time, and you'll probably notice your inputs aren't as snappy after playing for a while. That or your pinky finger stays curled or something. You'll need to recalibrate more than a few times during longer play sessions, but it's definitely not a deal breaker. One of my concerns is actually outside of play. In order to wash the gloves, you have to open the plastic compartment and disconnect the thin flex cable. Its connector feels very small and delicate, something I'd expect to see in electronics repair, not maintenance. Side note, be very careful handling lithium-ion batteries, as puncturing or bending them could result in a dangerous combustion. I was actually worried the gloves were bricked the first time I washed them, but turns out the cable was just ever so slightly loose. Now, there were a few early product hiccups. I couldn't use the gloves with Steam Link, and there was a weird false input on the joystick when my finger curls. These false inputs got worse later on, and one of my index fingers locked up. Aside from that, I have a few thoughts on the motion gestures as well. Trigger plus system menu takes a screenshot in Steam VR. Given that you need to curl your finger to reach the buttons, you'll end up taking lots of accidental screenshots trying to open up your menu. There's a gesture to move your thumb to your palm for a touchpad input. The motion is very different from an index controller, and games that rely on touchpad input might not always translate well. I also want to address the finger trigger gesture in particular. Look, it's functional. In fact, it makes logical sense to emulate the trigger in games where you do fire a weapon or other device. But lots of VR games use trigger as primary selection, and after a while, it just doesn't feel very satisfying to constantly twitch my finger through menus. One thing I would like to see is a pinch gesture, not as a replacement for anything, but as an option to bind things to. In my opinion, it's much more satisfying, and becoming increasingly common with hand-tracked interfaces. Now, pinch gestures were a little bit difficult to pull off in VRChat, so I am worried about potential hardware limitations. But with hand tracking coming to Steam Link and rumored support in Steam VR, I think it's something to definitely keep in mind. In short, the gloves are really interesting, especially for games like VRChat. It was pretty fun to use these here. Having the joysticks especially helps bridge the gap to PC VR. Still, the motion gestures aren't quite as snappy as triggers and buttons. After a while, you do start to find some of their weaknesses, in games where you might still want a controller. I know expectations can be pretty high, especially for the price of gloves and trackers. Even as the UDCAP inevitably gets tweaked before release, I would personally keep an early adopter mindset, possible issues here or there, and consider if the games you want to play make sense for the gloves. So, the UDCAP gloves are being launched as pre-orders on Kickstarter. Pledging to a Kickstarter campaign can be a bit of a gamble. A lot can happen as a product scales up for increased production, and I can't personally promise these will arrive exactly as I've experienced them, or at all. That's on UDEX Real to deliver. You can secure early bird pricing with $1 down at $4.99, with the final price set to increase later. With this pricing in mind, index knuckles are still far more practical for a wide variety of players. Sure, you lose some finger tracking fidelity, but you get halfway there for a fraction of the total price. On the other side, it's not that this price isn't fair, it's competitive with similar products. And considering how much these typically cost at a professional level, the $4.99 price tag is more accessible than ever for people at home. Of course, as I'm finishing this video, EOZ recently announced a cheaper IMU-based glove as well. It'll be really interesting to see what technology ends up top. But let's face it, you aren't getting these to be practical. You do it to experience an early taste of controller-free PC VR. Thank you for watching. And shout out to the Ko-Fi members Abisco, Swell, Cloudy, Skylar, and Seth.